This is a quick overview of the top 5 books to learn. Here we have the covers for the 5 books on 9/11 that I have selected. And the reason for books range. I want to know what happened on 9/11, tracing the ideology, anything odd, history of the World Trade Center, and all 5 of these books do represent different views. Each one is unique. As we get to some of the early chapters, we learn a little bit about the construction of the restaurant as well as the World Trade Center site. Joe Baum, the restaurateur who did the planning for the Windows on the World restaurant, a little bit about his bio in this particular chapter here. And then we learn some of the specifics about the Trade Center site and how they were having a discussion about whether or not the buildings would be able to withstand a direct hit from a plane. Since this is a restaurant, there was a concern about using electric stoves, and they were not allowed to put a gas line going 110 floors up. And going 110 floors up, when those planes hit the South Tower, that definitely would have been more devastation than was already created. The book also addresses some of the pop culture significance, where they talk about George Willig and Philippe Petit. George Willig, who scaled the building all the way from the ground up to the top, as well as Philippe Petit, who tight-walk roped between the North and South Tower. They did make a movie called The Walk, which is about Philippe Petit's walk between the North and South Tower. The book includes some photographs. Here we see some of the menu items that are being discussed, as well as the menu, and then some of the covers from magazines about this particular restaurant. The book does focus on the 93 Trade Center bombing and what was learned by the employees, the routine fire drills that would take place that would be able to familiarize the workers with the process of evacuating the Trade Center, which on a given fire drill could take about 4 hours. They addressed the last night, September 10th, as well as the last bill that was signed off on. Then they also addressed the falling man, and the argument is that the falling man was a worker from the Windows on the World restaurant. These are the 5 reasons why I picked this book. I just felt that it was a different look at the Trade Center. They focused on the role of the Port Authority. Pop culture, the restaurant definitely was a pop culture sensation. It's indirectly about 9/11, mainly about the restaurant. And it does give you a pretty good indication of what it was like to be in that restaurant throughout the 1970s. And then it makes you think about what if. For example, the decision to not go with the gas line, that one always amazes me that that was even a topic of conversation. The next book is the 9/11 Commission Report. This is a report by the government. In the first chapter, they outline everything that happened inside the planes, as well as beforehand when the hijackers boarded the flight, went through security, to Betty Ong, who was a flight attendant in Flight 11, who was communicating with air traffic control about what was happening, to Mohammed Atta, who was the lead hijacker in Flight 11, who accidentally communicated with the people on the plane as well as the people on the ground, and had said something about, we have some planes, which was possibly an indication to the traffic controllers that there was something wrong with Flight 11, to all of the planes that were in the air on 9/11, as well as some of the ideological origins of Al-Qaeda's thought process, which stems from the work of Saeed Qutb in his book Milestone. The 9/11 Commission Report also looks at the hijackers and the hijackers who were in the United States prior to the 9/11 attacks. What were they doing? How were they going through flight school? What were they doing the night before? All of that is addressed in the 9/11 Commission Report, as well as some of the communications prior to 9/11 between the federal government that may or may not have hinted at a possible attack. There's also a section that looks at what happened inside of the Trade Center buildings. Were they going to do a roof evacuation? What was communication like and the communication gaps with first responders? What was going on with the unique staircase system of the Trade Center? There were 3 transfer cases, which is what this is trying to address here. So it's not like a normal staircase where you're just constantly going down. What's going on in that transfer case is you're kind of leaving and then continuing to go down. And this creates a problem for the people who are trying to escape. How they put a command post at the ground level of the Trade Center site. And then once again, seeing some of those transfer cases and seeing the staircase in that unique design of that transfer case that creates further problems for people trying to survive. And then an odd statistic about the amount of people who actually stayed in the building, primarily the South Tower, when they were trying to save their work. And they put their work over their lives. Lastly, it was the conversation about who is in charge, the New York Police Department, Fire Department, or the Port Authority, and a lot of the miscommunication that went on between these three organizations. The 9/11 Commission report, pretty much a comprehensive look at everything. They talk about the ideology, the motives, the background, what happened on 9/11 that day, whether it's in the planes or in the building. This book definitely gives you a pretty good understanding of what happened on 9/11 and why certain things happened. This book I selected because it gives you a pretty good understanding of the construction of the building, looking at the chief architect and some of the concerns that he had, as well as the unique structure of the Trade Center, where you have the core strength of the building in the center, and then you have the floor attached to that center to the exterior wall, which is what this image right here is trying to show you. And then of course this is that exterior, and that's how the building was kind of put together. They also once again focus on what could be the potential impact of a jetliner hitting these buildings, and they were under the belief that this was going to be able to withstand that attack. An eerie comment from the 1960s about the towers could be the start of a new skyscraper age or the biggest tombstone in the world. Some additional information about the Trade Center construction, the land that was excavated from here, which was used to create landfill across the street, which is why when you see this 65 versus 2003, you really don't see any of that land, because this was what the Trade Center site was used to create that landfill. And again, you have more images showing the Trade Center construction, as mentioned before, the center column, and then this is that floor. So if I'm going to put a line here, that's what this represents here, and then this would be the exterior wall. And there was this understanding that these buildings swayed, which means that they were moving as wind would hit. They would kind of, go depending on the direction of the wind, which is what's going on here. They're talking about some sort of shock absorber that potentially could have been one of the reasons why this building ultimately collapses in the manner in which it does. The building has some photographs. Here we see the architect. Radio Row. This was a protest of radio shop owners who were upset about the building of the site, because that was going to mean that eminent domain was going to take away their businesses, and then some of the development where they would put people in wind tunnels to try to figure out if they were actually going to get nauseous from being in these buildings, considering that these buildings swayed. We then have some eerie imagery from the 1960s. This book does look at the post 9/11 period, and it looks at the cleanup. Here we have a map that was designed to determine what would be the best location for cranes. The cranes at ground zero. And then these maps are trying to show that damaged basement and where potential collapses. So you have to keep in mind that when these buildings fall and that rubble is there, that's what these maps, according to this book, are about. It's trying to determine where that safety is going to be for people who are trying to remove all of this debris to clean up after 9/11. So this book does address some of the cleanup that took place after the attack. Again, the book does focus a lot on architecture, and when you have an understanding of the way the buildings were constructed, you can get a pretty good understanding of the impact of the 9/11 attacks. In this image here, we see the impact of Flight 11 going into the North Tower, and these three items right here would represent those three staircases, because there was only three in these buildings that would allow you to go all the way up, all the way to the bottom. So when we see Flight 11 going into that plane, all of those staircases are going to be severed. Port Authority had built what were then the tallest buildings of the world without knowing how their components would hold up in a fire. The stairwells were encased only in lightweight gypsum board. The extensive crumbling of the escape routes trapped even some people who were well below where the planes actually struck. So it's hinting at some of the construction decisions that possibly could have led to additional loss of life. Here we see the theory on the collapse. And what's going on here is that you have 110 floors, and those 110 floors that are going up, they're only secured by that outside and that inner core. What's going on here is when that plane enters the building, when it enters right here, eventually that floor is going to sag and it's going to detach from here, which is what they're showing you here. The outside curtain detaching, and then that is going to force this floor to land on the next, creating more weight on this floor, which is then going to force this one to give, and then it just kind of crumbles in what becomes known as the pancake theory. Here are the reasons why I picked this book. It seems to be the book that is definitely about the architecture of the building, the purpose of the Trade Center, some of the politics, and then it focuses on the cleanup process. The next book, Perfect Soldiers, focuses primarily on the 9/11 hijackers, looking at the Hamburg cell, who were the hijackers coming out of Germany. They were college students dealing with the culture clash, and all hijackers, with the exception of this guy, Ramzi al-Shibh, would eventually go on with their mission. The book looks at each hijacker, Zaid Jarrah in this case, who was viewed as an unlikely candidate to become a member of Al-Qaeda. The book does focuses on the evolution of Al-Qaeda and their thought process, looking at the work of Abdullah Azzam, who would fight in Afghanistan and who would argue after the Soviet-Afghan War that is the duty of Muslims from around the world to leave their homeland and travel to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union. Bin Laden would eventually leave, as would al-Zawahiri, who would become some of the founding fathers of Al-Qaeda. Whether to carry out the jihad outside Afghanistan or stay and ensure complete victory in an establishment of an Islamic Republic, this is the work of Abdullah Azzam, who would eventually be killed, and then Al-Qaeda would take what he initially started in Afghanistan into a different direction. The primary focus of this book is primarily the 9/11 hijackers and how they felt lonely and homesick. There are a couple of photographs and what's going on in this photograph selection. You have Haider Zamar, who was a leader at the Al-Quds Mosque who fought in the Soviet-Afghan War, and he would come in contact with Mohammed Atta, who would be the lead hijacker crashing Flight 11. And then you have some photographs from prior to the 9/11 attacks, as well as the Al-Quds Mosque. The book focuses on the work of Hani Hanni, who was a licensed pilot in the United States, who would crash Flight 77 into the Pentagon. During the summer of 2001, we see the plot starting to unfold. We see Zaid Jarrah going through flight school, as well as some of the receipts as they went about their lives in the United States. The appendix is also good. They have Mohammed Atta's last will and testament, as well as the last night, which is a document outlining what the 9/11 hijackers need to do in the morning when they wake up. The reasons why I selected this book: it explains how the 9/11 hijackers became radicalized, what were they doing prior to 9/11, and in some odd way it humanized the 9/11 hijackers, mainly because I stopped being afraid. Not that humanizing them is a good thing, I mean they are terrorists. And then the odd things that I learned about these individuals. For example, that two of the 9/11 hijackers, Hazmi and Mintar, lived in the United States about 2 years prior to 9/11. About Muhammad Atta, who apparently liked to eat potatoes and was known to have a refrigerator full of mashed potatoes. Al-Shihi, who flew into the South Tower, how this guy was a foodie. He was known to have hard candy. Ramzi al-Shib, who was not a 9/11 hijacker. He could not get into the country from Yemen, but that this guy was kind of a jokester. That on the night before 9/11, the hijackers out of Newark went to a strip club. That Zaid Jarrah would get pulled over prior to 9/11, and he was issued a ticket. All of these things kind of were weird reading and finding out about this information. Number one on my list is the Looming Tower, because it pretty much gives you an understanding of the origins of Al-Qaeda as well as the thought process behind their ideology. Looking at World War I, the mandates in Arabia that split up the former Ottoman Empire, the work of Sayyid Qutb, and they do a pretty good job at analyzing Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb from Egypt, member of the Muslim Brotherhood, who would find the loopholes around the Quran to justify killing in the name of defense of Islam. Some images of some of the Al-Qaeda operatives as well as Sayyid Qutb. The book follows the thought process of Sayyid Qutb. Sayyid Qutb, who would write the book Milestones, and in Milestones he would outline numerous arguments. When is it okay to kill? How can you treat Muslim governments that are not trying to implement any sort of Islamic state? What can you do about outside forces that are going to potentially corrupt and prevent Muslims from practicing their religion? And then eventually leading to all of these ideals and then directing some anger towards the United States. The book focuses on some of the tension between Osama bin Laden and the Saudi Arabian government, as well as his anger towards the United States, which is a similar idea to Abdullah Azzam, who was his mentor, but eventually Abdullah Azzam would be killed, and eventually Al-Qaeda would be able to take some of his ideas and implement them for their own cause. And eventually looking at some of the 1990s attacks after Abdullah Azzam, the USS Cole, the Africa Embassy bombing, that would eventually lead to the creation of Al-Qaeda. Eventually we get to the 9/11 attacks, as well as Osama bin Laden declaring war on the United States and claiming that civilians are eligible targets because the United States, in his view, kills women, adults, and children, as well as innocent civilians. And keep in mind that there's also a series, The Looming Tower, that's based on this book, which tracks the work of John O'Neill, who was terrorism for the FBI, who worked with Ali Soufan. Ali Soufan will later go on to write his book, Black Banners, which was about all of the interrogating of Al-Qaeda operatives. So the reason why I picked this one is it traces the evolution of Al-Qaeda. If you read this book, try not to get caught up in the names. And keep in mind that so there you have it, my top 5 books on the topic of 9/11, each one unique. If I was looking for a book about the architecture of the Trade Center facility, I would go with this one. If I want to know about what happened on 9/11 that day, what was government doing, a little bit about the ideology of Al-Qaeda, I'd go with this one. If I want to know what the hijackers were doing, something pop culture, but indirectly still about 9/11, and one that is primarily about the evolution of Al-Qaeda, but also the events, all of the missed opportunities that eventually would lead to the 9/11 attacks. If you learned anything from this video, please like and subscribe.